Audio recording for this meeting has begun.
Okay, my name is Molly Marin. I am the webinar coordinator for the New York State RTI Technical Assistance Center. I have just a few reminders before we get started today. Keep in mind that all upcoming professional development offerings are listed on our webpage at nysrti.org. Also on our webpage under webinars and then today's webinar title, you'll find a copy of today's PowerPoint as well as a couple handouts that you may want to have during the presentation. And I'll put that link in the chat in a minute, but just know that the PowerPoint and handouts are on our webpage. During today's presentation, please use the chat box for any questions or comments that you may have. And at the end of today's presentation, we'll post a link to a brief evaluation. I'll also send that via email. If you could please take a few minutes to complete that. We do look at that feedback, and we appreciate anything you have to share with us. We are very pleased to have back with us Dr. Seth Aldridge today to present our Strand 15 series, Integrating Tiered Database Decision-Making to Address Essential Questions in an RTI Process. Today is the second webinar in the 5-session strand, and today's topic is grade-level data team meetings. Seth Aldridge is a certified bilingual school psychologist as well as a New York State licensed psychologist who earned his PhD in psychology at Syracuse University. He works as a school psychologist for the Homer Central School District and also consults with school districts across the U.S. concerning response to intervention for academic and behavioral difficulties. Seth consults with districts to utilize FastBridge learning as well as AimsWeb and other RTI assessments as part of database decision-making within a tiered problem-solving process. He is a consortium member with the New York State RTI Technical Assistance Center and works primarily with English as a new language learners as well as family court-involved youth in his private practice. He is on the editorial review board for School Psychology Quarterly and scientific advisory panel for School Psychology Review. Seth has published several articles in school psychology journals and has presented at many statewide as well as national conferences on topics such as using assessment information to inform instruction, intervention, tiered problem-solving approaches, database decision-making, program evaluation, peer tutoring, school-based intervention teams, and RTI for English language learners. And at this time, it is my pleasure to welcome back Dr. Seth Aldridge.
Thanks, Molly. Hi, everybody. I want to thank those of you who are back for a second session who had attended last session, as well as want to welcome people that weren't on last week's webinar. That was more of an overview webinar on tiered database decision-making to address essential questions. We looked at the overview and structure last time. Before we begin, I would like to know a little bit about you all, just in terms of your, your backgrounds. Well, if you could put up the poll slide about our demographics. So if you could just complete these demographic polls that we have. I see there are several people on the webinar today, and knowing who you are and your roles and various information about that will really help me with today's webinar, as well as future webinars where we see the kind of people participating in these. And I really try to gear some of the slides of information to the interests and kind of usage and roles of the people on the webinar. One of those things that I have to do before a presentation like this is do a full disclosure that although I will present several types of database products, AimsWeb, STAR is something that a lot of people around New York use. We'll have polls on your usage on those things in a little bit. I am affiliated with FastBridge Learning that also provides those kinds of tools. So I just want to do full disclosure on that before we begin. So I see we have a lot of some literacy interventionists, classroom teachers, literacy coaches, assistant principals, special educators, and a lot of people from grades 5 through 8. That's good to know. Grades K through 4. People that work with all grade levels, K-8, 9, 12. So we have a really nice, diverse sample. And I think We've got, do we have another poll in the beginning of demographics, Molly, or is I think maybe it's just these two? Okay, so we'll go ahead. What I'm going to do, for those of you who are new to this and weren't there on the webinar last week, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're going to cover today, but then I'm going to present several slides on what we did last week. I'm going to go through those slides very, very quickly, and you'll see a review on them, and I'll talk about those in just a little bit. But I want to talk, so initially we'll do a little bit of review and kind of activate that prior knowledge. We're going to talk about, really today, grade level data meetings, where we really sit down at a grade level at least 3 times a year, and then progress monitor reviews in between. We're going to talk about who should be at those different meetings. We're going to talk about some specific meeting steps and procedures to answer essential questions. We're going to be talking about using different measures to look at core instruction and prioritize students for targeted tiered support. So really, again, addressing the important questions that the data is to address. What are the important questions? We're going to really look at a little bit about some diagnostic assessments, because those should be in your toolkit as well. Our RTI assessments for universal screening and progress monitoring are important elements in the toolkit, but there need to be some other things to really understand learning needs so that we can target those interventions. So we'll talk about those. We'll talk about planning progress monitoring logistics. That should be part of especially your fall data meeting. And use of information collected at meetings for other kinds of decision making. We'll try to use this pointer to kind of direct some of the slides. I will say some of the slides that you'll see are a bit text heavy. I probably won't apologize for that. I do that intentionally. I won't be reading through many of the slides like I just did now in terms of the things that we'll cover. I will really more talk about that topic, but I like these PowerPoints are available for download. If you're like me, I like to go in and download the PowerPoint and review them later on. So I hope you find the PowerPoint helpful as you go. And there will also be some files that you can use to support some of the things that we talk about today. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We already did the polls. I went out of order here. We're going to go through some slides where there are going to be review on them. Again, hopefully, I'm going to go through these very, very fast. So for those of you who were on the webinar last week, these are some things that you've already seen. But I do need to put what I'm going to talk about today in the context of these things. For those of you who are new, these are topics that were addressed last week, and you can either play the recorded webinar from last week and or download the PowerPoint from last week. But I just kind of want to, again, remind people that we're talking about the 3 tiers of RTI. Tier 1, all students, Tier 2, some students, Tier 3, intensive care, and if there are specific intensities, there are intensities of intervention and assessment that go along with each tier, and that we look at these things for academic. We can do math, literacy, other areas, although our focus is typically on literacy. My apologies to those who are really focused on math. I know that I will try to talk about math as that is important, but when we look at referrals to special education, about 80% are for literacy-related problems. I will try to talk about math as well. And then also behavior. We have to, and when I say behavior, what I mean is social, emotional, and behavioral challenges that we need to address. Those 3 tiers. So we talked about that quite a bit last week. I do want to go through the essential questions. Without knowing what questions we're trying to answer, we're not really effective in collecting our data. Any data, any assessments that we conduct are intended to address a certain question. And the key questions that we're trying to answer are, what do students know? What are their needs, and what do we need to teach? Are programs and practices in our schools effective? Who are the students who we prioritize for additional supports? Progress monitoring individual students. Do I need to stay the course or make an adjustment based on the data? And then using data to make more system-level changes or adjustments, such as acquiring new materials, allocating materials, scheduling, and professional development. These are the tiers, this is part of the tiers of decision-making that we'll be talking about. If our data is such that we can't really put it together to communicate it effectively, we're going to be data hoarders, not data users. So being able to put that data together to communicate with key audiences is going to be huge. So these are the questions. So I hope that you'll see, and one of my objectives of this webinar is to show you how at a grade level data meeting we can address many of these questions. And there are certain procedures and steps and processes and people in the room that make us able to use our data to address these questions really effectively. Okay, again, another review slide is our tiered problem-solving process. I'm going to go through this very, very quickly because this was covered last week. We talk about informal discussion with colleagues, post-benchmark data meetings, and progress monitor checkup meetings. This is the focus of today's webinar, these post-benchmark data meetings and progress monitoring checkup meetings. Next week, we'll be talking about the art of progress monitoring, so data-based decision-making based on progress monitoring tools. After that, we'll be talking about the following webinar will be on individual problem-solving meetings and that process. And then the final webinar that we'll have will be on more school and district decisions that we need to make that include multidisciplinary team meetings, where we look at special education decisions, and school and district decision-making, where we incorporate our data to make those school and district decisions. Okay. Again, we're going to be focusing on post-benchmark data meetings and checkup data meetings. That's the focus of today's webinar. We reviewed this last week. There are certain assessment qualities and assessment purposes that we need to have for our universal screening. I'm not going to go through all of these again. These were covered at last week's webinar, but it's very important that our universal screening tools, synonymous with benchmark assessments, have certain qualities so that they can address questions effectively, and that we know the purposes of those assessments up front. We don't use assessments because for reasons such as, well, we've always used these, or I know how to use this assessment, therefore I'm going to use this. They are really intended to address specific purposes that we should be covering to address those questions that I mentioned before. Okay, so here's another poll. I would really like your input on the universal screening tools that you use in your school, as well as RTI progress monitoring tools used in your school. I know that many districts use STAR and AIMSweb, and certainly there are other, those are probably of the several districts that I work in and consult with, we often see STAR and AIMSweb being kind of probably the most frequently used. There are other assessments out there. Some of them may not be really intended for RTI universal screening, certainly not for progress monitoring, but those are the tools that the schools have available, so they use those tools to some degree. If I just give you a minute to kind of fill out this poll. All right, and thank you for that input. All right. And of course, part of what will drive what you use for universal screening are things like, are you an elementary school, are you a middle school, are you a high school? Different tools are appropriate for the different grade levels. Certainly RTI is mandated in New York State for K through 4 in literacy. Sometimes that's our focus. And again, STAR and AIMSWeb are pretty good tools for that. And a lot of our slides will focus on STAR, AIMSWeb. We'll use some FastBridge slides that you'll see for particular reasons that you'll see. And I've got to see some chat here. I will address the chat sessions a little bit later on, so I'm not ignoring the chats. Those are really important, and if you would please give your input in the chat, we will be addressing those at the end of the webinar. So thank you very much for those. We're going to really address today the grade level post-benchmark data meetings. These meetings typically occur September, January, and May. This is when we typically collect those benchmark assessments. There are national norms that go along with STAR, AIMSWeb, FastBridge, DIBELS. Typically we have that fall, winter, and spring universal screening sessions. And then in between, we want to be reviewing data for those, especially for those students who are struggling, and we're collecting progress monitor data, and we want to be responsive to that data. And there are a number of ways that districts do that. So we're going to go on there. I would like to do another poll here, again, trying to get some input from you all. And I also look at this data after the webinar to kind of learn a little bit more about our participants. So do you currently hold grade level meetings after each benchmark session? I would really appreciate it if you'd weigh in on this poll. And is it with additional grade level meetings to formally review progress monitoring data? Yes, 3 times a year. We have meetings to review benchmark data, but not with the entire grade level, partially or no. If y'all could weigh in, that will really be helpful. So I see a real some real diverse results here. So thank you for weighing in on that, those of you who did. I'm going to go through these polls pretty quickly because we've got a lot of slides to cover. So thank you for that. I'm going to really try to make a case here for doing grade level meetings. I've been a school psychologist for almost 30 years now, and I worked on the school-based intervention team project in Syracuse City Schools, and it was a really enlightening project, and we did some really good work there, I think. But those meetings that we really used data for individual problem solving. And I found that in many ways it was very helpful, and that kind of process is really important. But then I found that the more I use them, post-benchmark grade level meetings can be really important. So if you're only using individual student problem solving, like many schools do, there's kind of a problem with that. If we do the math, in a typical school of 450 students, most people would agree, and I've done this presentation, most educators kind of nod your head when you ask them this question, probably 20% of the students in that building need some kind of problem-solving process. There's something that we have to address with about at least 20% of the students in the building. Well, that's 90 students. If we had 2 traditional individual, a lot of these problem-solving team meetings, if you want to call it school-based intervention teams, intervention assistant teams, pupil service teams. There are all sorts of names for these problem-solving meetings where we address individual students. You would be able to have, if you had 2 of those 30 to 40-minute meetings, 40 weeks in a school year, you would meet on only 80 students. That's without any review. Your last 10 would apply, and many of these students really need a meeting in September. We have to really address their needs right away. Many of them, you've got data in the spring, so you can really begin kind of getting your ducks in a row at the grade level for multi-tiered targeted supports. And they need those meetings in September, and they also need follow-up, many of them do. So at a grade level data meeting, We put all the data together with all the necessary players there. We consider all the available resources to address the needs, and schools have an opportunity to make some really important decisions that benefit all students in a timely manner. So we do some standard it's kind of in many ways in September, it's kind of a triage meeting where we really get students into intervention in a timely way. And then we also determine the students who really need a more intense look and who really we want to have some intensity about their interventions. There's a lot of really good reason to have everybody at the table for those grade level data team meetings. So when do they happen? Post-benchmark data meetings, we would say after the fall, winter, and spring administration of this universal screening. So we really want to take that data. There's been a lot of work that went behind collecting those assessments. Who are going to be at the meeting? We want to have everybody there. Grade level teachers, interventionists, school administrators are really important, support staff. Again, we kind of covered this last week at last week's webinar, so I'm going to go through this very quickly. You examine grade level needs, and you get people students into timely supports. So I'm going to go through this very quickly. There's a lot of advanced preparation that we talked about last week. You really want to have your ducks in a row as you get into that meeting. And again, that was covered last week. But I have to say this, even we were talking a lot about infrastructure here and scheduling in these meetings, having even subs for the meetings if you need to cover teachers to attend. I think it's really money and time well spent. But if you don't have the interventions, then this infrastructure will go nowhere. It's really important that educators really have the effective tools and professional development so that they can really implement the interventions that are planned. So we don't want to forget about that part. We talked last week about the intervention menu, and that is available for download on the TAC site. Again, more about kind of preparing for that meeting. Everybody should be aware of the data. It shouldn't, at the first data meeting, it shouldn't be the first time that you've seen the data. You should be aware of how to use the data. That's some professional development that needs to happen. And I'm going to kind of go through these very quickly. The district hopefully will have some decision rules that we talked about last week to determine who might, what does our district, in our district, who would be considered for Tier 3 intervention, who would be considered for Tier 2, and who are some students that need support at Tier 1. So those are some district guidelines that might be different from district to district about allocation of resources. And I shared this last week, so this is, again, just review. Okay, so now we're getting into the meat of this presentation. What are the steps to that post-benchmark grade level meeting? First, we're really looking at an examination of core instruction and looking at what percentage of the students are at risk. Is this something that we can address through Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions because we've got relatively few students that warrant that level of intensity and that our core is pretty effective, so we don't need to make core adjustments? Or is this something, do we have enough risk that we really have to address these problems through core instruction as well as tiered intervention? And there's some different opinions out there. There's some good resources, RTI Action Network, the National Center for Intensive Intervention, IRIS at Vanderbilt University, and our own New York State Response to Intervention Technical Assistance Center site that has information on database decision making and data meetings where we make some decisions and we do problem solving. I think some people would say, and I wonder, I would maybe take issue with this, that if more than 20 or 30% of your students are at risk, well, you don't put students into tiered interventions. You really work only at core. That probably would be a school-to-school or district-to-district evaluation. I probably would argue that even when we've got an abundance of risk, we still want to have some tiered intervention for those students who are really struggling. We know that there are some students that need that intensive care and there are specific interventions that could really prevent them from having long-term chronic problems, and those need to be in some very small intensive groups. But first, we're looking at what is the level of need across the core. We're really looking at program evaluation. Is risk reducing over the school year? And in this presentation, and this is, I think, maybe something unique about this webinar, is I'm going to really look at, there are different questions that we want to pursue and that we need to cover at the fall, winter, and spring benchmark meeting. So we'll talk about that. The second step is we need to prioritize students for targeted tiered interventions, and I'm going to focus on targeted because we need to know what the needs are. And we don't necessarily group students just based on we often say tier, the most intense need is in red on the graph. Yellow sometimes is the universal color for tier 2 or students at some risk, and then green being tier 1. But we also need to prioritize students not just based on the color that's on their graph, but also what their need is. So we target them. We'll talk about that. And then we talk about, so what are the needs based on some diagnostic assessments that we might have conducted for those students, plan and assign them to targeted tiered interventions, plan supports at tier 1 for those students that couldn't fit into tier 2 and tier 3 if there are those students. Also differentiation for students who are excelling and have already mastered the content. I think that's important. And identifying progress monitoring logistics, that's an important part of this meeting, especially at the fall benchmark, and identify reasonable goals for those students. And talk about who are students that need additional diagnostic assessments or need another individualized problem-solving meeting. So these would be the steps of that post-benchmark data meeting. But the questions really are different in the fall. And you've got another assortment of questions because you have more data in the wintertime. And at the spring, we've got sort of a different process going on. So I'm going to kind of talk about seasonal post-benchmark data meetings. In the fall, and again, I apologize for the small print on this, but I want you to be able to kind of take this away and use it if you want to. If you want to download the PowerPoint, this is something you can refer back to. In the fall, you've got a different, you're really planning for the year ahead. So there are a number of different questions than you would have for the winter and the spring. So you come in maybe 2 or 3 weeks into the school year. Students are all students in the grade level are being assessed. And many times you have to have a little caution at looking at this data. Sometimes we're assessing post-summer rebound and regression that we see after the summer. Many times we'll see that initial data point is quite low, and then we see sometimes the first progress monitoring point when we give the same assessment a couple of weeks later, that data jumps right up because they're now getting back into school. So you have to be a little bit careful about the fall benchmark data. It's really helpful to triangulate your fall data with spring. One thing that we look at is our students in the fall, is it similar to the needs in previous years? So we kind of look at is this incoming class, is there more risk than in previous years? Is our risk reducing over the years? That's kind of looking at core instruction. Are we improving with our programs and practices? Where are the areas in our core instruction where we need to focus some support? Are there certain areas based on, in some universal screenings, you can kind of tear it apart by the big 5 ideas or 5 pillars of reading, or certain things in math where students are struggling. And so we have all the data on the table. All the teachers are there, the interventionists there, the administrators are there, the support staff are there, and we really look at the data and say, okay, where are we? How can we support all students at the grade level? What are some gaps? Where are we being successful? You might find at the fall benchmark that you've got an abundance of risk, and it's interesting because when I look at some other websites on database decision making or resources on database, literature on database decision making. They say, well, if you've got more than 20% at risk, you have to consider changing your core instruction. That's not necessarily true because students are coming in with this risk. It might be from your incoming kindergartners or the previous grade level that is responsible for that level of risk. And it's possible that last year's grade level did a tremendous job with those students. There was even more risk the year before with that cohort. So you really have to judge others with caution and really kind of look at all of the data and consider that data over time before you judge that. Step 2, prioritizing students for targeted tiered intervention. This is really where everybody gets on the same page with what the interventions are going to be. We do triage. We identify those students that would be need the most intensive supports. And again, this is where you have to have that caution about possible, if you're assessing too soon in September, you might be assessing some regression in skills based on summer. And if you look at your Springs data and try to triangulate with other assessments that you have on the students, that can be extremely helpful. Step 2B is you look at the some diagnostic assessments if you have those available. Again, you might have them available from spring. I think an excellent practice is after your universal screening, you might identify some students that you say, wow, when we get to our post-benchmark meeting, we might want to have a few more, some more information about these students. And then you collect some more information on those students so that you can hit the ground running when you get to that data meeting. I'm losing my arrow here. There we go. And then we, step 3, we assign students to targeted tiered intervention. And at the fall benchmark, this is extremely important. You know, we're really getting our groups together for students that may need some short-term intervention or some long-term intervention. This is a significant step at the fall. And then what's really important is that when we see an abundance of risk at the grade level, that we don't overload our Tier 2 and Tier 3 groups. That Tier 2 typically no more than 5 to 1. Tier 3 typically no larger ratio than 3 to 1. That there's a level of intensity at these groups. And that there might be some students that really can't fit in those groups, that we really have to address their needs at Tier 1 through core instruction. And we have to discuss how are we going to do that. And that's what I think a lot of authors talk about when they say, you know, when you've got more than 20 or 30% of students in your grade level who are at risk, you really have to look at Tier 1. You have to look at how you're going to support them at Tier 1. Many school districts don't have the resources to address more than 20 or 30% of their students in Tier 2 and Tier 3 intervention. Every school, every grade level is different about this, and this is why it's so important to have those decision rules that we have and be guided by them, not handcuffed to them. After step 4, we identify progress monitoring logistics. As you can see at the fall benchmark meeting, we're really got some pretty intense decisions. We're really getting our ducks in a row for the year. And so this is a very significant step at the fall benchmark, that you're just beginning to identify those students who are going to get progress monitoring. What are the tools that are going to be used for that progress monitoring? We'll talk about this at the next webinar, progress monitoring logistics. How do we set realistic but ambitious goals? How do we choose tools that are a general outcome measure for the kinds of interventions that we're providing, the instruction and interventions that we're providing for students? So there's a lot of planning that goes into your progress monitoring logistics. We want to make sure that our students who are in intensive care are really getting very frequent progress monitoring so that we can be responsive to that data. And that's step 6. We're going to identify those students that, you know, our rule that we have at data meetings is if we're talking about an individual student for more than a minute and a half or 2 minutes, we need to refer that student to individual problem-solving meeting, or it might be a parent meeting, or but some other kind of meeting, or maybe we need some further diagnostic assessment because we really don't understand the needs adequately to target the intervention. So the fall data meeting, we've got a lot of decisions to make on students, but if we spend, say, 2 or 3 hours as a team, I think we can save an enormous amount of time later on because we're going to be working more efficiently, we're going to be using our resources more efficiently, we're going to be identifying gaps in core instruction, gaps in our interventions, we're going to be identifying assessments that we need to move ahead. So I think it's a terrific investment to have these kinds of meetings. Now, when we get to our winter meeting, we've got some different decisions to consider. By our winter meeting, we've now collected another benchmark. We might see that some students that we thought were at high risk in the fall maybe aren't so much at risk. But the first step, again, step 1, is we look at core. We look at all students, and I'll show you some graphs that illustrate this question. Has risk reduced from fall to winter? Are there resources or professional development needs that need to be brought to the district team about because we see some needs at core instruction? We always look at core first and what our needs for all students are. Then we might reprioritize students for targeted tiered interventions. By the winter benchmark, not only do we have that universal screening data, but we also have some progress monitoring data on a select number of students that were prioritized for that. At the winter benchmark, we also might have had some time to collect some diagnostic data. And at the winter benchmark, we may, and this is really important, a tiered intervention should not be a life sentence. When we see that a student has made goal-level progress and they're really kind of ready to be released from a Tier 2 or Tier 3 intervention, maybe they go from Tier 2 to just some supports at Tier 1. Maybe they go from Tier 3, an intensive intervention, to a slightly less intensive intervention. Being able to kind of release students from that kind of intensity is very important because now you're freeing up resources for students now who you've identified at the winter that maybe weren't picked up at the fall and need intervention, or students who aren't responding to intervention in Tier 3 or 2, where you need to kind of intensify intervention for those students. But the winter benchmark is a really great opportunity to sort of reshuffle a little bit and allocate resources a little bit differently. You really need everybody at the table to do that. And when you have all the grade level teachers at the table looking at all the cohort of students, understanding that their colleagues have kids who are also at risk, you see a lot of creative problem solving happening around the table. Having the administrator there is really important because it gives permission to maybe change the schedule or to just allocate some resources a little bit differently. Having support staff there that are familiar with data and can support the process. All the interventionists there that are really working with the students. Having everyone there really helps with that decision making and allows us to be flexible and use the data to make some changes. So then we, again, by the winter time, hopefully there'll be some further diagnostic information. We know that students who have things like phonemic awareness difficulties at the earlier, well, throughout the grade levels, where that is a real need, we have to intervene in those areas. Phonemic awareness, phonics, accuracy and fluency, vocabulary comprehension, those core components. In math, you want to, if you're doing this for math assessments, where's the process, where is the need for our students in order to group them appropriately, identifying those gaps in instruction that we need. So having those diagnostic assessments to understand their needs, and we'll have some slides in just a second to address that. So reassigning them to targeted interventions that would be appropriate intensity, Planning needed supports at Tier 1, again, just like you did at the fall benchmark. Re-identifying progress monitoring logistics. Maybe you release students or change their progress monitoring because the intervention has changed. Some students may not need progress monitoring anymore. Others may need more intensive progress monitoring. You make those decisions at the meeting. And again, prioritize students for individual problem-solving meetings or further diagnostic assessments. Now we're at the spring, and now spring is kind of upon us, and this might be a good data meeting for us to have in the next few weeks. So this is kind of a reflection meeting. A lot of times by mid to end of May, there certainly are instructional weeks left, but we're also kind of reflecting on the year. So I'll be showing you some graphs that illustrate has the grade level produced a decreasing risk among the cohort. So has risk reduced from fall to winter to spring? We reflect on that. If risk has increased, we really need to examine what we've done. If it's reduced, we want to recognize some of the positive things that have happened. So we're reflecting on our instruction over the course of the year, and then kind of moving forward, looking at that data. So are there resources and professional development needs that need to be brought to the school and district team? So many times at this data meeting, sometimes we only spend 2 or 3 hours at the grade level data meeting covering these steps. We're not going to solve some of the bigger problems that need to be addressed at a grade level, school, or district level. In terms of identifying professional development, acquiring and allocating resources, scheduling. Sometimes it's a school or district team that needs to support us with that decision making. And we need school and district teams that are listening to the grade level interests. And this is an opportunity to document and express those needs. We might, again, kind of look at those students at the spring benchmark. There's some instructional time left. We might kind of try to get our last efforts in for those students. So we might, again, prioritize students for targeted tiered interventions. It's also a good time to be planning for next year. At the spring benchmark, we might kind of be identifying who are some students that are going to need continued intervention next year. And then we might still have some meetings that we need to plan at step 6. So depending on when you hold your spring meeting, if you're holding it in mid-June, probably not a lot of instructional changes happening. If you're having it in mid-May, we still got instructional month. But again, you can see that the questions and needs at these grade level meetings change with the seasons. Okay, so again, we kind of went over the steps in each grade. I'm going to go just a little bit more in depth on some of the steps. So all teachers review and discuss grade level data. That they should be familiar with that data before they get to the room, and should have some ideas about what's working in their classrooms, what's working in their intervention groups, what are some of the needs that we have. Is core instruction working and effective for the great majority of students? At least 75 to 80%, we would say. And there's a reason that we use those numbers, and you'll see that in just a second, I think. What changes need to be made to core instruction? Are there class-wide problems to address? Maybe there are, sometimes you'll see that there are certain classrooms that just got a really tough hand, and we really want to support those classrooms. So we need to kind of look at that. And plan differentiated supports at Tier 1. These are some of the graphs that we would use. Star, you see that, again, kind of the universal coloring of these students, and the list would be provided below, would be at high risk, some risk, and then these students would be kind of low risk. Ames Web, kind of nice. They've got these tiered tiered transition reports, they're called. I'm going to show you a blow-up of this because it kind of, again, addresses some questions, and as well as instructional recommendations report. And FastBridge has similar kinds of reports where we look at students and prioritize them by risk. So this is an example of an Ames web chart, and this is where I was talking about, is risk reducing over the course of the year. And I want to go a little bit into this kind of chart because I think sometimes, and again, although I'm using an Ames web example, I think that you really could apply the concepts and make sure that you understand graphs like this and how to apply them to other tools. So in a typical school, and it's important to understand that typically these types of charts are not norm referenced, they're criterion referenced. And by that I mean they would say if you're in red, you're at high risk. High risk is typically you've got less than a 50-50 chance of being successful on some other test or criteria. Typically it's a state test. In a typical school, this is kind of interesting because whether it's FastBridge or AimsWeb or STAR, I want to say Dibbles, but I'm not sure. Typically, we look at 15%, about the lowest 15 percentile in a national measure or a national norm would be in red. Typically, it's the 15th percentile is the cutoff for being high risk. Even though it's a criterion score, it seems to be kind of universal. So in other words, in a typical school, you would see about 15% of the students kind of at that high risk level. In a high-performing school, you would see less or fewer. And in a low-performing school, you might see, like this particular grade level, 34% of the students came in at high risk. That's a lot. More than you would be able to provide Tier 3 to. In a typical school, this would be, again, 15%. In a typical school, and again, this is, again, pretty universal across a lot of different products, AimsWeb, FastBridge, STAR. Typically, it's about the 45th percentile that you would see be 45th percentile and higher. In other words, typically about 55% are in green. In this particular grade level in the fall, only 46% are low risk. This isn't the grade level. This was what they inherited in the fall. And you can see that over the course of the year, when we look at that first step of the meeting, is our grade level reducing risk? In this case, we see that risk is reducing over the course of the school year. That's a really positive outcome for this particular grade level. And then by spring, we now see that fewer than 15% are in the high-risk area. 73% are low risk. This is a really nice story with a nice ending. We've gone from a grade level where we had an abundance of risk to a pretty high-performing grade level. So we know that they're really doing something right. It's important to know that these are based on criterion cut scores. In other words, scores that predict risk. And again, typically the product will tell you how those criterion are set. Many products will allow you to correlate the test with the New York State test if that's a focus area for you. Okay. When we look at allocating resources, I'm trying to get my arrow back here, we often use local norms. And the reason for that is we need to allocate resources according to what we can provide students at that grade level. And then our national norms are a reality check, and I'm going to illustrate that with some graphs in just a second. But first, what I'd like to do is do a couple of polls. How many people agree with the following statement? Okay, Molly's putting that up. Let's see. Oh, I'll let Molly post these. So the first question I have is, how many would agree or disagree with this statement? Tier 2 and Tier 3 interventions should not be provided until 70 to 80% of students in a school are above the 25th percentile based on national norms. In other words, when you see an abundance of your students who are at risk, you only work on core. You don't work on, you don't put students into tiered interventions. I'm going to spend just a little bit of time on this, but I'm seeing most people kind of disagree with that, and I think that would be the overwhelming consent. When you talk to teachers, they would say, okay, we might have a lot of risk here, but we still need to provide Tier 2 and Tier 3 to students. And that kind of, some literature disagrees with that. I tend to say, no, we need to provide tiered interventions, even though we might have a grade level that has an abundance of risk. We still need to put kids into those tiered interventions. So thank you for those of you who weighed in on that. The second question being, does our school, do you agree or disagree with this statement? Our school does not have the resources to effectively address more than 25 to 30% of our students in additional tiered small group instruction. And I see most people agree with that statement, and I agree with that statement. Most schools, you go to a high-achieving school where there's very low risk, they often put about 25% of their students into tiered intervention. You go to a low-performing school where they've got an abundance of risk and lots of kids really struggling, they still provide intervention to about 25% of their students. It tends to kind of fit that tiered model. Unfortunately, some of the products will say they label their criterion scores as Tier 3 and Tier 2 as if you've got 50% of your kids in red and yellow, kind of those some and high risk areas, they would say, well, those kids should get Tier 2 and Tier 3 supports. And that's a problem because you may not have the resources to do that, and you end up watering down your intervention supports. That's why we use those local norms. And then the third poll that I had, based on your universal screening, RTI data, and test scores, our district is, are you high achieving, low achieving, Lake Wobegon, where everyone is above average, it's a super high achieving. This is kind of being cut off on my screen. Or you don't know. There we go. No vote. Okay. So we see, I see a lot of people that would rate themselves as kind of low achieving. So this is especially where you would be at risk for trying to put too many students into those intervention groups, and why using local norms for resource allocation, where you're saying, okay, look, we can afford to put about 10% of it. We've got these resources on the table. We can afford to put these kids into Tier 3. We've only got resources to go this deep into the population. We can go this deep into the population for Tier 2 supports. When we run out of those supports, we're going to have to support the other students at Tier 1. And we really have to provide teachers with support so that they can deliver that core instruction effectively. Thank you for those polls, Molly. And thank you for those who weighed in on that. Okay. And I just have to, Molly, I don't have an arrow to progress to the next screen. Thank you. So for AIMSweb, here's an example of a graph. And again, although I'm using an AIMSweb example, you would have a similar kind of graph for STAR or FastBridge, where anytime you've got a local norm, you're going to have within that local norm, if everybody's below average, you're still going to have below average compared to that cohort. some that are between the typically 10th and 25th percentiles, the way they break their color coding down, between the 25th and the 75th percentile, 75th to 90th, and above the 90th percentile, to help you differentiate instruction for students who are at these kind of risk levels. And we tend to allocate services locally. We make these decisions based on local norms. Here's our reality check. Even though this student might be considered above the 10th percentile locally, they're below the 10th percentile nationally. This is our national norm, is a reality check. This student is above average locally, but average compared to a typical school across the country. Our national norms provide a reality check for us. And then a 3-color coding report is typically a criterion reference report where these scores would predict a less than 50% chance of passing a criterion. These scores would be somewhere between 50 and 80% chance of passing. And if you're low risk, you have at least 80% chance of passing, say, a state test or something like that. That's how we use the criterion referenced reporting. And with FastBridge, it kind of puts everything kind of on one page. So you would have exclamation points for one exclamation point if there's some risk based on a criterion, 2 exclamation points for high risk. You have your grade level, your district, how you compare to kids across the district, how you compare to students across the grade, and then how you compare nationally. So it's kind of, you have these different reports depending on the product or the data collection device. It really helps districts to kind of look at that data and prioritize and understand how their grade level stacks up, and you can kind of work up the list to prioritize students for those tiered interventions. STAR would have, and another question you might want to say, is this grade level atypical? So I kind of like being able to look at data over the course of years. For STAR, you've got a report that helps you to look at risk over the years. I really like this one with AIMSweb, where in this case, in 2004, 2005, we had the average score at about 80. And then over the course of about 12 years, we see that our spring average score has really improved. In fact, we can say that our winter score at this grade level is the same as students were performing about 10 years ago in the spring. That this grade level has made really nice improvements, even though incoming students are almost the same. Well, maybe not. Incoming students have also improved over the course of the year, or the course of 10 years for this particular grade level. So you get some longitudinal data that really helps to say, over the years, are we making some nice progress? So step one, you review. What percent of students are at risk, some risk, and at high risk? Is risk reducing over the course of the year when you get your winter and spring data? And is risk reducing over multiple years when you've got longitudinal data? When you've got a data system that enables you to look at these kinds of things, it really helps you to make some good decisions on program evaluation. Are there subgroups whose risk is reducing or increasing? You might look at English as new language students, or special education, students in special education, students receiving certain interventions. That might be pockets of students who you're really addressing in a very effective way, or not so effectively. And so what are, kind of breaking that instruction down, are there areas of instruction that you really need to address? And so that's step one review. Reflecting on current practice, and you would bring this information to the school or RTI team. Now, really what you're doing at these grade level meetings is it's part of the problem-solving model, where the problem-solving model is where you identify and try to understand the problem identification and problem analysis. You try to understand the present level of performance, and that helps you with program evaluation. You make decisions about resource allocation and professional development. This is where you're planning the intervention, so the next step in the problem-solving model. You set goals for students. That might be setting goals for individual students or setting goals at a grade level. If we've got this many students at risk in the fall, we're really going to try and reduce risk through our interventions and through core instruction changes or intensity by the winter. And you look at future benchmarks, help you to evaluate whether your plan is working. Both benchmark assessments where you see reducing risk as well as progress monitoring data that help with those decisions. I'm going to go kind of quickly through these as I see our time is getting limited. These kinds of graphs really help you to prioritize students at risk, where you would have, you tend to kind of work up the list. And it really helps if you know what interventions you've got to offer students when you begin to kind of prioritize them for risk. And STAR has charts that the list of students would be below on STAR. With AIMSweb, you can kind of work up the list to allocate, everybody's at the table, and you kind of provide groups that are both targeted, based on targeted needs and intensity. And FastBridge has a similar. They kind of have some really similar qualities to them. You have to know what interventions are available to students. Sometimes we look at, okay, we've got this many reading teachers, we've got this many teacher assistants, we've got these perhaps software interventions or technological interventions. We've got these interventions on the table. How do we put students into those interventions in a timely, effective manner? Based on, and we also would have decision rules that are typically developed by the school or district RTI team. And then once you really get everybody at the table, you get some really creative ideas how to stretch those resources. Now we have to look at instructional needs, and there's some diagnostic decisions that we want to make. And two different definitions for diagnosis. One is to really pathologize something. That's not what we're talking about here, to label something. We're really looking at trying to understand the problem so that we can address it. We can't really address a problem until we understand what it is and we identify it. And there are all sorts of different levels of diagnostic assessments, from informal observations. Teachers are assessing all the time. Listening to children read, watching them perform math calculations on a sheet. And they're constantly observing kind of informally. Then you might have some curriculum-based evaluation. There might be some a bit more formal in the way they would observe certain things, really looking at percent accuracy of a student reading in curriculum materials, really documenting error patterns in how students engage with classroom text, say, or math calculation problems. Where is the skill breaking down? We have universal screening data that might really help us to diagnose certain problems. And then we go to commercially available assessments. We would really only want to provide it as we go from less time and intensity with these assessments to more time and intensity and money with these assessments. We would really want to prioritize students for these more intensive diagnostic assessments. So we drill down. When we the drill down method is if they have a problem with comprehension, we check fluency and accuracy. When there is a problem with fluency and accuracy, we really want to understand, is there a phonics or phonemic awareness problem? The same could be said for math. Where is, if there's a math applications deficit, they can't apply those math skills, where is that process breaking down? And then also want to consider motivation, vocabulary, engagement, other factors that might be contributing to the hierarchy of skills. So we want to, I'm going to skip over this just for the sake of time. I'm going to skip over these, but if you want to just have this available to you, for lack of time, I'm not going to go through this exercise. But where 15% of the words are replaced by nonsense words, this is the experience of a student who isn't reading the text in front of them with, this is the experience of 85% accuracy. Most adults can't understand this. When we go to 90% accuracy, they still can't understand it. And not until we can read with about 95% accuracy are we able to comprehend the text. These kinds of assessments and understanding the percent accuracy of text reading is really important when we're trying to understand, say, a comprehension difficulty that the student is having. So we need to, before we assign students to those interventions, we really need to understand what the problem is and target students, not just based on, again, the low score. We might have groups of students who are color-coded red with students who are color-coded yellow because they have similar needs. So you might identify all the staff and resources that can deliver interventions, get a rough but realistic sense of how many students would be able to fit into groups of highest intensity, then put students into lower intensity groups, and then determine students who would be able to be, whose needs could be addressed in Tier 1. And then support Tier 1. We talk about standard protocol interventions for groups based on certain needs, and plan instruction and interventions based on those needs that they're demonstrating. And there might be students then that would get Tier 1 support. These students are below target, so they're still at some risk. And again, this is, happens to be an Ames web chart. These students, we work up the list. These might get Tier 3 supports. This student might get a Tier 3 support. These students might get Tier 2. This student might be included in the Tier 2 group. We want to also sometimes have a certain degree of heterogeneity in groups. We want models in those groups, but we also want to have students with similar needs. Then we want to, step 3, we plan and assign students to those groups. We really want to take notes of the groups. This particular resource is available on the RTI TAC site for you to download. The students that are going to get Tier 3, what the need is, what the intervention is going to be, what are any barriers to providing that intervention, and what the progress monitoring tool is going to be. And you would do the same thing for students that are going to receive Tier 2 supports. I'm going to go over this next week at our May 17th webinar, where we describe those interventions that students are receiving. Then we would want to plan supports at Tier 1. So we would have students that weren't able to fit into the Tier 2 and Tier 3 groups, but we document those students and what needs they have and how we can support them in Tier 1, and whether or not we would want to provide some progress monitoring for them. Then we get into the progress monitoring logistics, which is what we're going to be talking about quite a bit next week. So I'm not going to go over that too much. We'll be talking next week about the different kinds of goals that we would want to set for our progress monitoring, whether it's norm reference, criterion reference, rate of improvement goals, or inter-individual framework kinds of goals. But they have to be realistic yet ambitious, and we'll talk a lot about that next week. And then students we might prioritize for emotional behavioral supports. There are some academic screeners out there that are web-based on the universal screening tool. AIMSWeb and FastBridge both have screeners for social, emotional, and behavioral difficulties. Or you can just kind of work up your list based on teacher nomination and then have some meetings on those students later on. Step 6 is we want to identify students that need further meetings or further diagnostic assessments or a different kind of meeting. Many times those questions and needs will not be addressed at a grade level data meeting. The grade level data meeting can provide supports and plan supports for the great majority of students, but there are a number of students that are still going to need another meeting. And so you want to document those with everybody there. Those individualized 30 to 40-minute meetings, we really want to prioritize who get those meetings and get the students with the most needs in first. We'll talk about individualized problem-solving meetings on the 4th webinar in 2 weeks. And then we want to discuss how we're going to share information with parents. How do we have perhaps case managers that support teachers with the interventions, making sure that they're followed through with? Really encouraging people to seek help. Teachers, if we're planning core supports, making sure that they can provide those core supports. They've got a lot on their plate. The follow-through is high stakes for these students. Then we have progress monitor checkup meetings. I'm going to go very quickly through. We're going to be talking a lot about progress monitoring next week. These would be in between the universal screening benchmark meetings, about at least once in between the fall and winter benchmarks and once in between the winter and spring benchmarks. Having everybody at the table, again, to kind of reshuffle and respond to the progress monitoring data can be very, very helpful. I'm going to, for the sake, I'm going to skip this particular poll just because we're kind of nearing the end of the webinar. And for time's sake, we've had a lot of slides today to go through, so I apologize if it went pretty fast, but you can always download the PowerPoint. When we're at this checkup meeting, we really want to recognize who's making progress based on our progress monitoring data, and we'll look at that next week. Celebrate those students who are really making progress. These meetings shouldn't be just all about the negative. Really focus on some positive things that are happening at the grade level. Are there patterns of what's working? Recognize those things and strengthen them or keep them. It's also important to allow for students to be dismissed from tiered intervention to provide room for other students so that you can increase intensity for others or include other students into interventions because some students might not need those interventions anymore. Who are students that really need a core instruction or intervention change? For those not progressing, we need to change things up. Interventions should be coordinated with classroom instruction, really important. Are there students that have similar needs? Plan those intervention changes and who would have a different meeting. Some of the same steps that we would have in the post-benchmark meeting. But having everyone at the table, interventionists, teachers, administrators, and support staff, really allows for decision-making and flexibility. So hugely important. So thank you very much. That concludes the PowerPoint. Hopefully we still have some folks hanging around that I can address any questions that we have. I see some people have posted some of the chat on the chat. If you could continue to, number one, post any questions on the chat and fill out the evaluation form that Molly has available for you. So if anybody has any questions to post, I'm kind of reading through some of the previous posts. I see, can you name some of the RTI organizations that have some literature on database decision-making, I'm presuming? Some of the sites that you can go to are the RTI Action Network. RTI Action Network is an excellent site. It tells a lot of information about RTI there. The National Center for Intensive Intervention, excellent site for both academic and behavioral interventions. And I certainly would want to plug our own New York State RTI Technical Assistance Center site, where you can download a lot of information, lots of PowerPoints, webinars, resources, and it covers our 5-year pilot project with the RTI Technical Assistance Center. So those are some really helpful sites. Those particular sites also address database decision-making, the topic of today's webinar. Any other questions that you all have? Oh, I missed one. Also, the IRIS site at Vanderbilt University, IRIS, is an excellent site for RTI. A lot of resources there. I'll hang around for as long as anybody needs. If you want to type some questions into the chat box, I'd love to hear from you.
And while we're waiting for them to type, I see a couple of people typing. I did post a link to the evaluation. And Seth, I thank you again for another wonderful webinar. We'll give it a minute or two here, see if any questions pop up, and then we'll end. Okay, well, I don't see any more. Hopefully you'll all join us again next Tuesday for the third webinar in our 5-series strand. So we do hope you're back online with us. I'm going to end the recording now and wish everybody a good evening.